LSAC has finally removed the logic game section from the LSAT and replaced it with the second scored logical reasoning, raising the question, will removing logic games reduce LSAT scores? A lot of students have been asking me how the removal will impact LSAT score medians going forward. Now, logic games were my worst section of the LSAT back when I first started studying for the LSAT, and they were a large part of the reason why I was stuck in the low 150s for far too long. I would have gotten my official 175 LSAT score much faster if they hadn't been on the test. Instead, it took me an entire year, at least half of which was wasted time. So for me, removing logic games would have increased my LSAT score, and I imagine the same is true for many others with humanities backgrounds like me. I personally majored in political science. I know a lot of you have as well. On the other hand, removing logic games would likely reduce LSAT scores for STEM majors, but there are far more humanities majors than there are STEM majors applying to law school, so a version of the test without logic games is easier for more people. We should draw a distinction here because the LSAT being easier doesn't mean it's easier to get a top score, because LSAC just adjusts the curve to account for how students perform. In fact, April LSAT scores were lower than many test takers expected, and it could be that LSAC is looking to reduce all that recent LSAT score inflation, because LSAT score medians at law schools across the board are out of control. In particular, LSAT medians at the T14 are all 170 or above, and this is likely due to the fact that during the LSAT Flex format and the pandemic, there was a lot of LSAT score inflation. Basically, LSAC messed up the curve. They underestimated the fact that taking the test with only 3 sections and no extra unscored section would make it a lot easier to do well, or that it'd be a lot easier to study for the LSAT at home and even take it at home without the stress of going in person to a testing center with the proctors and with the other students. Another little discussed fact is that it's become much easier to get extra time accommodations on the LSAT. Used to be you had to fight tooth and nail just to get time and a half on the LSAT, meaning you were getting 53 minutes per section rather than 35. Now, all you got to do is get a doctor's note and you can get double time, triple time, or beyond. In fact, you got 160 minutes per section, while the standard timing is only 35 minutes per section. So this person's getting an extra 2 hours and change per section on the LSAT, taking it over 2 days with unlimited breaks. And so lots of score inflation for a variety of reasons. Now, that aside, the curve could become slightly more lenient without logic games, meaning you might be able to get a few more questions wrong and still get a 170, but because it's harder to get a perfect score on logical reasoning and reading comp, that doesn't mean it's actually easier to get a top score, because again, LSAC can just adjust the curve. In LSAC's own analysis of the data, looking at versions of the test with games and without, they found the curves overall came out pretty much the same. Of course, some individual people do better on one format versus the other, but in aggregate, the curve was nearly identical. Bottom line, it is what it is. If you're taking the LSAT in August or beyond, you're taking the test without logic games, and you're going to have that second scored logical reasoning section. So you're going to want to focus your time on logical reasoning, since it's now 2/3 of the test going forward, and there are roughly 15 different types of logical reasoning questions, depending on how you count them, but not all of them are equally frequent. Some show up more often than others. Overall, the most common types of logical reasoning questions are necessary assumption, inference, and flaw. So you want to master those types of logical reasoning questions before you move on to the less common types like parallel, parallel flaw, and evaluate the argument. But you don't want to just stop there and look at types of logical reasoning questions based on question stem type. You also want to look at the method of reasoning in the stimulus, meaning the argument. You want to get crystal clear on the different types of arguments, the different types of reasoning that show up on the LSAT. And you also want to look at your review process in depth to make sure that you understand which questions you're getting wrong and why, which ones you're having difficulty with, so that you can course correct, shore up any weak areas, learn the basics that you're missing, so that you can improve for next time. Because every question that you get wrong is an opportunity to learn something new. And until you determine which tricks and traps you are personally uniquely prone to falling for, you can't help but end up making the same mistakes again. And so if you're looking for help mastering logical reasoning and the review process, I have developed a framework to guide students through this process called the Socratic Review Method. It is a cornerstone of my courses and my one-on-one coaching programs. You can check out the links below this video to find out more and to book a call with me and my team. We'd be glad to help you out. And of course, we can all lament the end of logic games. I'm personally sad to see them go, even though they start off as my worst section. They ended up being probably my favorite section to do for fun going forward. But of course, it is what it is. And law schools won't care which version of the LSAT you took. They just want to see that score out of 180 because, again, that goes to the American Bar Association, which in turn goes to U.S. News for inclusion in the ever important U.S. News Law School rankings. And that's what helps law schools raise their medians, raise their status in the rankings. It's the biggest impact you can make on your odds of getting into law school. Anyway, folks, that's all for now. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care.